January 26, 1945. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The Alsatian plain lay buried beneath a silence so heavy it had weight. 3 feet of snow pressed against the earth like a funeral shroud. In the sky above, low, gray, the color of old pewter, offered no warmth, no mercy, no horizon worth looking toward. The forest of Outnumbered stood at the edge of that plain like the last wall of a collapsing world, its pine trees stripped bare by weeks of artillery, their broken crowns jutting upward at strange angles, fractured monuments to the violence that had already passed through this place, and the violence that was about to return. The temperature hovered near zero. The frozen ground was so hard that shovels struck it and rang out like bells. 18 American soldiers crouched in positions they could barely call defensive, their feet numb inside their boots, their rifles slick with frost, their faces drawn with the particular exhaustion that does not come from one bad night but from months of accumulated terror. From somewhere across those open, snow-covered fields, a sound reached them, low at first, barely distinguishable from the moan of the wind. Then it grew. The mechanical groan of tank engines, the crunch of armor on frozen earth. And then the white-suited infantry emerged from the mist of Holtzwihr village, advancing in waves across the field. 250 men, moving with the quiet, practiced confidence of soldiers who knew exactly what lay ahead of them, and did not fear it, what they could not have known, what no military calculation, no intelligence briefing, no tactical doctrine could have prepared them for, was what was waiting for them at the edge of that forest. Not a battalion, not a company, not even a platoon in any meaningful sense. What waited for them was one man, one 19-year-old boy from the cotton fields of Texas, one soldier who had already been shot, stabbed by shrapnel, racked by gangrene, and left for dead more times than the paperwork could properly record. One soldier who, on this frozen afternoon in Alsace-Lorraine, would do something so far beyond the recognized boundaries of human courage that those who witnessed it would spend the rest of their lives struggling to find words sufficient to describe it. His name was Audie Leon Murphy, and this is the story of what happened when 250 German soldiers came to finish him. To understand why this field mattered, why these particular trees, this particular frozen road, this particular village church visible in the gray distance, you must first understand the strategic desperation that had brought Germany to this moment. By January 1945, the Third Reich was a nation consuming itself. To the east, the Red Army had crossed the Vistula and was driving toward Berlin with a momentum that nothing in the German order of battle could arrest. To the west, the catastrophic failure of Hitler's Ardennes offensive, the last great gamble of the Wehrmacht in the west, a massive armored thrust through Belgium and Luxembourg that had briefly electrified the Nazi high command with the dream of splitting the Allied lines, and forcing a negotiated peace had ended in frozen disaster. The German army had bled itself nearly white in that final offensive, expending irreplaceable men, machines, and fuel for no lasting strategic gain. Now the Allies were pushing back and pushing hard, but there remained one piece of French territory still in German hands. In the area surrounding the city of Colmar, in the Alsace region near the Rhine River, the German 19th Army clung to a bridgehead, roughly 850 square miles in area, a bulge of territory on the western bank of the Rhine that the men who fought there simply called the Colmar Pocket. It was the Reich's last foothold on French soil, and it mattered immensely. The bridges it contained across the Rhine were lifelines. Its loss would shorten the Allied line, free up divisions for the push into Germany, and open the western bank of the Rhine, that last great geographic barrier before the German heartland itself, to Allied exploitation. The German 19th Army, commanded by General of Infantry Siegfried Rasp, knew all of this, and so they held. They held with understrength divisions, supplemented by Volksgrenadiers, held with assault guns and tank destroyers in numbers that dwindled every day, held with what remained of their armor complement, and what remained of their will. And when the Allies pressed, they counterattacked, ferociously, desperately, with the violent energy of men who understood that retreat meant the end of everything they had been told to believe in. It was into this cauldron that the American 3rd Infantry Division, veterans, hardened fighters, a unit that had fought from North Africa to Sicily, to Anzio, to the beaches of southern France, was now committed. Assigned to the French, the Second Corps under the broader Allied effort to reduce. The Colmar Pocket, the 3rd Division's 15th Infantry Regiment, was tasked with some of the most punishing fighting of the entire campaign. The terrain was merciless, flat, open fields interrupted by villages that the Germans had converted into fortresses, rivers and drainage canals that cut across every axis of advance, and a landscape buried under snow so deep and cold that men could not dig in. The frozen earth, hardened to something approaching concrete, denied the American infantry the most fundamental protection available to a soldier under fire. They could not go down. They could only go forward. By midnight on January 25th, what remained of Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, had pushed some 600 yards into the Bois de Holtzwihr and established a position facing the village of Holtzwihr. The cost of reaching that position had been devastating. Over the previous days of fighting, the company had suffered a casualty rate that should have removed it from the order of battle entirely. 102 of its 120 enlisted men had been killed or wounded. Every officer had fallen. Of the original fighting strength of the unit, only 18 men remained capable of holding a rifle. And commanding those 18 men, this shattered remnant of what had once been a full infantry company, was a 22-old second lieutenant who had not come up through officer candidate school or been commissioned fresh from a university, but had instead been given a battlefield commission for acts of valor, so extraordinary that the army had decided the most appropriate reward for his courage was to give him more responsibility for it. Audie Leon Murphy was born on June 20th, 1925, in Kingston, Texas, the 6th of 12 children born to Emmett and Josie Murphy, sharecroppers who rented land they would never own to grow cotton they would never be paid enough for. The family moved constantly, Farmersville, Greenville, Celeste, wherever the next rental agreement might be had, living in houses that barely qualified as shelter, in a poverty so complete and unrelenting that it had its own specific texture, its own specific smell. His father abandoned the family when Audie was a child. His mother died when he was 16, leaving him effectively the head of a household of younger siblings, a boy who had never been permitted the luxury of simply being a boy. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade. He learned to hunt out of necessity, becoming by his teenage years a marksman of uncommon precision, not because he had any particular gift for violence, but because in the economy of a sharecropper's household, a missed shot was food that did not reach the table. Every bullet had to count, because there were never enough bullets, and there was never enough of anything. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, Murphy was 17 years old. He attempted to enlist immediately, presenting himself to recruiters for the Marine Corps and the Army paratroopers, both of whom turned him away. He was underage, visibly so, and his physical dimensions alarmed those responsible for assessing military fitness. When he finally succeeded in enlisting in the United States Army in June 1942, his medical examination recorded his height at 5 feet 4 inches and his weight at 112 pounds. His frame was described as slender. His face was so young, so conspicuously boyish, that the men of his training unit gave him the nickname Baby. He looked, by all accounts, like someone's little brother who had snuck onto the troop transport. By mistake, what the medical examination could not measure and what his appearance could not suggest was the precise quality of will that resided inside that slight frame. It was not recklessness, not the impatient bravado of a young man who has not yet learned to fear death. It was something colder, more considered, more dangerous, the kind of courage that emerges from a life in which the alternative to acting is dying quietly, in which hardship has been so continuous that it has ceased to function as a deterrent, and has instead become a kind of bedrock, something you stand on rather than something that knocks you down. Murphy had been in poverty's front lines his entire life. A German machine gun nest was, in its essentials, just another problem that needed to be solved. He landed in North Africa in February 1943 and joined Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, the same company he would one day command under. Fire. His superiors noticed him quickly, a quick-thinking soldier, composed under pressure, accurate with any weapon placed in his hands. In July 1943, he went into action for the first time at Licata, Sicily. He was promoted to corporal by the end of that month. At Salerno, he single-handedly charged and eliminated a German machine gun nest that had pinned down his platoon. By December, he was a sergeant fighting in the Anzio bridgehead, where he destroyed a German tank and drove back an enemy attack, earning the Bronze Star. He refused evacuation to the hospital during bouts of illness so severe that his commanders had, on at least one occasion, to forcibly drag him to an aid station against his will. He was back in the line before most men would have been cleared for light duty. He re-landed in France in August 1944 as part of Operation Dragoon, killed 2 snipers, and destroyed another machine gun nest, and earned the Distinguished Service Cross. In October of that same year, he earned 2 Silver Stars in 3 days for fighting through German ambush, personally killing and capturing several dozen enemy soldiers before a German sniper's bullet caught him in the hip, and the resulting gangrene hospitalized him for months. He discharged himself from hospital before his wounds were fully healed, and returned to his unit by January 1945. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy, still only 19 years of age, had accumulated a combat record that should, by any actuarial calculation, have killed him multiple times over. He had been wounded, infected, and nearly blown apart in 3 separate theaters of war. He had buried friends whose names he still carried with him, weight that no medical record could measure and no promotion could address. He had seen in Sicily and Italy and France what industrial violence does to a human body, the particular indignity of it, the way it strips a man of everything that made him a man before it takes his life. And he had gone on anyway, not because he was indifferent to death, but because he had decided, somewhere in the calculus of a life that had given him no softness to fall back on, that indifference to personal survival was the price of protecting the men beside him. Those men, on the morning of January 26, 1945, numbered 18. They held a line at the southern edge of the Bois de Outnumbered, positioned in a natural U-shaped formation where 2 fingers of forest stretched toward the open fields and the village of Holtzwihr beyond. Murphy had set up his command post in a drainage ditch beside the road running through the trees, 10 yards in front of the rear of 2 M10 Wolverine tank destroyers that had arrived at dawn to support the company's position. His equipment at that command post consisted of an M1 carbine, a pair of binoculars, a map, and a field telephone connected by wire to battalion headquarters approximately 1 mile to the rear. The ground was too frozen to dig. The men walked in circles in the snow to keep their feet from going numb. Reinforcements were expected, but had not yet arrived. The nearest substantial American support was a mile behind them. The northern end of Holtzwihr village, 400 yards across the open field, remained in German hands at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The sound began. The German force that emerged from the mist of Holtzwihr that afternoon was not a collection of desperate rear-guard conscripts fighting their last engagement. It was a deliberate, calculated, well-equipped counterattack, committed by commanders who understood the strategic significance of what they were attempting to reclaim. 6 Jagdpanther tank destroyers, formidable machines, carrying an 88mm gun behind armor plating thick enough to deflect the American tank destroyers' own 90mm rounds, rolled out of the village in line, their white-painted hulls nearly invisible against the snow-covered fields. Behind them, advancing in skirmish order under the protection of a heavy artillery bombardment, came approximately 250 infantrymen. These were not ordinary line infantry. They were men of the German 2nd Mountain Division, a formation specifically transferred from Norway for service in the Colmar Pocket. Trained mountain troops, experienced, disciplined, dressed in white. Camouflage that made them nearly impossible to distinguish from the snowscape across which they advanced. Their tactical objective was the road that ran through Murphy's position and into the forest beyond, the road that, if seized, would give German armor access to the 3rd Division's regimental headquarters, and potentially unravel the entire American position north of the Colmar Canal. They came across those fields with the quiet confidence of men who had done the arithmetic. 6 armored vehicles, each carrying an 88mm gun, capable of defeating anything the Americans could field. 2 full infantry companies, 125 men each, armed with machine pistols and rifles. Artillery support that had already begun falling on the American positions before the first tank crested the last rise. Against this, at the tree line, stood 18 American soldiers who had been fighting continuously for days, who could not dig in, who were nearly out of ammunition and whose armored support, the two M10 Wolverines, had been entirely destroyed within the opening minutes of the German advance. The rear Wolverine took a direct hit from an 88 mm round that killed its commander and gunner. The surviving crew abandoned it. The forward Wolverine, attempting to maneuver into a better firing position, slid off the road and into a drainage ditch. Its main gun tilted at an angle that made it tactically useless. Its crew climbed out and withdrew into the forest. The situation had become, in the bleak language of military assessment, untenable. Murphy knew this with the clarity of a man who had been in untenable situations before and who had learned to move through them rather than be paralyzed by them. He ordered his company to withdraw into the deeper protection of the forest, to the secondary defensive line he had prepared in anticipation of exactly this eventuality. He ordered them to go, and then he stayed. He stayed not in a fit of suicidal romanticism, not because retreat had become impossible, but because someone had to remain at that field, telephone, and direct artillery fire onto the advancing Germans. If the company simply melted back into the trees without suppressive fire, the German infantry and armor would reach the forest line before the withdrawal was complete, and they would catch Company B in the open, unformed, and destroy what remained of it. Someone had to hold that phone. Someone had to keep talking. Someone had to look out across those fields and call in the coordinates while the shells fell. Murphy had determined that if one man could do that job, there was no reason to sacrifice others. And so he stayed with his M1 carbine and his field telephone at the edge of the world. Sergeant Elmer Brawley, the company's platoon sergeant, would later provide sworn testimony describing what he saw from the tree line as he withdrew with the rest of the company. He said, "As we withdrew, hundreds of infantrymen poured out of the woods firing automatic weapons as they came. Lieutenant Murphy stayed on at his command post under a pine tree at the edge of the woods and directed artillery fire by telephone upon the advancing tanks and infantrymen. The enemy's 6 tanks crashed through on both our flanks, firing persistently at the lieutenant and shattering branches of trees at his side with shell fragments. In a storm of machine gun fire from the tanks, he coolly went on telephoning fire. Orders. The German armor came within 50 yards of Murphy's position. Passing it, historians later determined, because the enemy tank commanders wanted to avoid the burning hulk of the rear Wolverine that sat on the road between them and the forest. And so, by a margin of yards and the quirk of a burning vehicle's geometry, Murphy found himself in the eye of the storm, the tanks pressing past on either flank, the infantry advancing across the field toward him, the artillery falling in curtains of snow and smoke and shrapnel wherever he directed it. He fired his carbine until the magazine was empty. He loaded again. He fired until the next magazine was empty. He kept talking into the telephone, adjusting coordinates, walking the artillery fire across the German line, watching through smoke and snow as figures in white camouflage crumpled and fell and were replaced by more figures in white camouflage. Pressing forward, and then his carbine ammunition ran out. What happened next? What Murphy did in that moment when his rifle was empty and the Germans were still coming is documented in military records, sworn affidavits, and the official citation of the Medal of Honor. It is not conjecture. It is not embellishment. It is simply what occurred. He looked at the burning tank destroyer. The vehicle sat on the road, approximately 10 yards from his position. It was on fire. Its ammunition load, hundreds of rounds for its .50 caliber machine gun, dozens of 90mm shells for its main gun, was in imminent danger of cooking off in the heat, at which point the vehicle would detonate with a force sufficient to kill anyone in its immediate vicinity. A second Wolverine's ammunition, exploding, would send shrapnel across a radius large enough to make survival at 10 yards extraordinarily unlikely. The German infantry was advancing toward him across open ground. The German armor had passed his position and was pushing into the forest. The field telephone was still connected. The artillery officer at the other end of the line was still waiting for coordinates. Murphy climbed onto the burning tank destroyer and mounted the .50 caliber machine gun. The .50 caliber machine gun. It is worth pausing in this moment to consider what that weapon represented, not merely as a mechanical instrument of war, but as a symbol of everything the German 2nd Mountain Division was advancing against. The M2 Browning, as it was formally designated, was a product of American industrial democracy in its most concentrated form, designed, refined, manufactured in the millions, shipped across oceans in the holds of vessels built by workers who had never seen a battlefield, assembled in factories that ran 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, by men and women whose names would never appear in any military record, but whose labor was as essential to the Allied war effort as any general's. Strategy. Each belt of ammunition that fed through that weapon, each brass cartridge, each heavy bullet, was the product of a supply chain stretching from the copper mines of Montana to the assembly lines of Connecticut to the ammunition dumps of Normandy to this frozen field in Alsace where a 19-year-old boy from Kingston, Texas, now stood on a burning vehicle and brought it all to bear against 250 soldiers who had come to kill him. The rounds were armor-piercing, capable. The Germans knew this. Private Charles Owen, watching from the tree line, later recalled. The Germans were deathly afraid of .50 calibers. They had armor-piercing capabilities, and Murphy knew exactly what to do with them. He had determined, within seconds of mounting the weapon, that the 90mm shells of the M10's main gun, the rounds that had already failed to penetrate the Jag-Panther's frontal armor, bouncing off its steel plates like stones thrown at a bank vault, would be similarly useless against the German tanks. He did not waste a single round on the armor. He turned the weapon on the infantry dot. This was not a panicked, indiscriminate spray of fire. Murphy swept the .50 caliber across the advancing line with the same cold precision he had learned as a boy hunting for food on the red clay plains of Texas, where a missed shot had consequences that went beyond embarrassment. He targeted the concentrations, the clusters, the moments when the German infantry bunched together in the drainage ditches and folds of ground that offered them the only available cover. He fired in controlled bursts. He moved the barrel in slow arcs. He reloaded and fired again, and the German advance, which had been moving with the confident momentum of a force that knew it was overwhelming its opposition, began to stall. Lieutenant Walter Weispenning, an artillery forward observer who had relocated to Company B's position after his own communications were severed watched from the tree line with the particular attention of a man whose professional obligations required him to assess what he was seeing with precision. He later recalled, "While we attempted to hold off the tanks with directed artillery fire and bazooka rockets, the crowd infantry line, consisting of 2 full-strength companies of 125 men each, surged across the open meadow at a wide arc. As they advanced, they fired their machine pistols and rifles at Lieutenant Murphy. Then I saw Lieutenant Murphy do the bravest thing I've ever seen any man do in combat. With the Germans only 100 yards away and still moving up on him, he climbed onto the slowly burning tank destroyer and began firing the .50 caliber machine gun at the crowds. There he was, completely exposed and silhouetted against the background of bare trees and snow, and a fire under him that was ready to blow the tank destroyer to bits, with .50 caliber machine pistol and rifle fire crashing all around him. The smoke billowing from the burning vehicle provided Murphy with something approaching concealment, though it was the concealment of a man standing in the middle of a fire, visible when the wind shifted, and visible when it did not, breathing. In the acrid chemical smell of burning rubber and engine oil and ammunition casings warming toward their ignition point. The German tanks, which had pressed past his position toward the forest, now returned to support their lagging infantry. They fired directly at him. 2 88mm rounds struck the tank destroyer itself, the concussive force of their impact throwing Murphy against the turret with a violence that should have knocked him from his perch. He reappeared through the smoke both times and resumed firing. The rounds of .50 caliber ammunition kept moving through the weapon. The belt fed, the gun fired. The brass casings ejected in arcs into the snow below Dot for 30 minutes, then 40, then approaching an hour. Murphy maintained this position, firing, adjusting the artillery by telephone, reloading, firing again. On a platform of fire, surrounded by fire, burning beneath and around him, the German army pressing toward him from every direction and finding, each time they pressed, that the fire from that burning vehicle was still coming, the old wound in his leg, suffered in October, had reopened in the course of his exertions, and his trousers were soaking through with blood. He would later note, with the characteristic dry understatement that those who knew him recognized as the particular humor of a man who had entirely stopped being surprised by anything the world could do to him, that for the first time in 3 days his feet were warmed out at one point. A German patrol managed to work its way around under covering fire and approach through a drainage ditch to within 10 yards of Murphy's position, close enough. When the smoke momentarily parted for Murphy to identify them clearly, 12 men rising from the ditch, preparing to rush the tank destroyer and end it. He swung the barrel of the .50 caliber across and opened fire from a distance of 10 yards. The 12 men did not reach him. At another point, an anxious voice on the other end of the field telephone asked him to provide the current coordinates of the German infantry. How close were they, exactly? Murphy's reply passed immediately into the oral history of the American Army. Just hold the phone a minute, and I'll let you talk to one of the bastards. And then, in what may be the single most consequential and revealing tactical request of the entire engagement, Murphy called in artillery coordinates. On his own position, he judged with the arithmetic of a man who has reduced survival to its absolute essentials. that American shrapnel falling around the burning tank destroyer was preferable to 200 German infantrymen reaching it. The artillery fell. The shrapnel mixed with the rifle fire and the tank rounds and the fire and the smoke, all of it converging on this one point on the frozen Alsatian plain where a boy from a Texas sharecropper's cabin was holding the line. The German 2nd Mountain Division had been trained in Norway. They had fought in terrain that made the Alsatian plain seem almost gentle. High passes, vertical rock faces, conditions that would have destroyed ordinary infantry. They were, by any objective assessment, elite soldiers. They came to Holtzwihr on January 26, 1945, expecting to face a broken, understrength American company that had been badly mauled over the preceding days and possessed no meaningful armored support. They came expecting, in the language of their tactical briefings, a swift and decisive recapture, the boys to read Weir. What they encountered instead was a single American soldier who refused, through an hour of fire and blood and the imminent detonation of the platform beneath his feet, to concede a single yard of frozen ground. The transformation in the German tactical calculation was not gradual. It was abrupt and it was complete. The 6 Jag-Panther tank destroyers, which had advanced through the American position with such confidence, found themselves without the infantry protection that armored vehicles require in a forest environment. The German mountain troops, pinned by the .50 caliber fire, could not reach the wood line and clear the way for the armor. Without the infantry, the armor could not advance. Without the armor, the infantry could not push forward across the open field. The attack stalled in the snow, caught in the feedback loop of a single weapon operated by a single man, who had decided that this particular piece of ground was as far back as things were going to go. The German commanders, surveying a field now littered with their casualties, with American artillery continuing to fall at coordinates that should have been impossible for any observer to maintain, made the decision that commanders make when the mathematics of an attack no longer add up. They began to withdraw. Murphy remained on the burning vehicle until his field telephone went dead. Then, only then, he climbed down. He walked back toward the tree line, covering the distance through open ground under fire, with the measured pace of a man who had decided long ago that running was not something he did in view of the enemy. Shortly after he reached the cover of the forest, the ammunition of the burning tank destroyer finally ignited. The explosion was massive, blasting the turret on which Murphy had been standing, into the air. Had he remained at his post 2 minutes longer, there would have been no Medal of Honor to award. There would have been no body substantial enough to find. He reached his company. He refused medical treatment. He was bleeding visibly from the leg. He organized the survivors of Company B, and he led them forward in a counterattack, forward into the field from which the Germans had just been driven back to the original positions they had held that morning. Sergeant Elmer Brawley stated under oath, "Lieutenant Murphy, refusing to be evacuated, led us in a strong attack against the enemy, dislodging the Germans from the whole area." Private First Class Anthony Abramsky, watching from the company line throughout the engagement, offered this assessment. For an hour he held off the enemy single-handedly, fighting against impossible odds. Although his wound looked really bad, he refused to wait for treatment. He reorganized the company and led us in an attack which swept the German force back into the woods they had come from. The fight that Lieutenant Murphy put up was the greatest display of guts and courage I've ever seen. Company B had come to Holtzwihr with over 100 men. It had been reduced to 18 by the time the German attack began. By the time it was over, those 18 had held the line. Lieutenant Colonel Keith Ware, executive officer of the 15th Regiment, would later state that Murphy's actions that day prevented the remnants of Company B from being surrounded and entirely destroyed, and that their destruction would have threatened the 3rd Division's entire position in the northern sector of the Colmar Pocket. That is not hyperbole. That is the considered assessment of a senior officer evaluating the operational significance of a single man's decision to remain at a field telephone on a burning vehicle while the German army tried to kill him. Holtzwihr fell to American and French forces the following day, January 27th. Within 2 weeks, the Colmar Pocket had been entirely eliminated. The Germans lost 25,000 men in the effort to hold it. The last German foothold on French soil was gone. The reports of Murphy's actions reached higher headquarters within days. They moved quickly through channels, as such reports sometimes do when the events they describe defy the usual categories available to military bureaucracy. On June 2, 1945, 4 months after Holtzwihr, 2 days before what would have been the first peacetime summer of Murphy's adult life, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, commanding general of the United States 7th Army, presented second Lieutenant Audie Leon Murphy with the Medal of Honor near Salzburg, Austria. The official citation read in part, "For an hour the Germans tried every available weapon to eliminate Lieutenant Murphy, but he continued to hold his position and wiped out a squad of German enemy who attempted to creep up under cover of the machine gun fire." The official citation concluded, "His directing of artillery fire wiped out many of the enemy. He killed or wounded about 50. Lieutenant Murphy's indomitable courage and his refusal to give an inch of ground saved his company from possible encirclement and destruction, and enabled it to hold the woods which had been the enemy's objective." Murphy reportedly arrived at the ceremony in the same state of barely concealed anxiety he brought to all public recognition of his service. General Patch, himself a decorated and distinguished officer who had commanded armies across 2 theaters of war, is reported to have whispered to Murphy as the ceremony began, "I wonder if you're as nervous as I am." Murphy, standing informal, uniform beside the most decorated general in the 7th Army's chain of command, replied, "Yes, sir. I'm afraid I am." By the end of the war, Murphy had accumulated what the United States Army would later certify as the most complete catalog of valor decorations awarded to any American serviceman in the Second World War: the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 silver stars with oak leaf cluster, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star with V device and oak leaf cluster, 3 Purple Hearts, the French Legion d'Honneur, the French Croix de Guerre with silver star, the Belgian Croix de Guerre with palm, the Combat Infantryman Badge, 33 decorations in total, spanning 5 campaigns across 3 countries, representing every major category of military valor that the Allied nations could find language to describe. The most decorated American soldier of the Second World War was 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighed 112 pounds on the day he enlisted, and had grown up in a house without enough food. He returned to the United States in August 1945, a few days before his 21st birthday, and found himself, almost without preparation, famous. His photograph had appeared on the cover of Life magazine, and his face, boyish even now, despite everything it had witnessed, looked out from newsstands across a country hungry for its heroes. The actor James Cagney had seen that photograph and extended an invitation to Hollywood. Murphy made more than 40 films over the following decades, including many westerns, and in 1955 he played himself in the film adaptation of his own autobiography. To Hell and Back, a title drawn not from dramatic convention, but from precise personal experience. But the war had left its mark in ways that the cameras could not capture and the award ceremonies could not address. Murphy suffered, for the remainder of his life, from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition for which the medical and cultural vocabulary of the 1950s was entirely inadequate, and which carried with it a stigma that the same society that celebrated his valor was not yet capable of honestly confronting. He slept with a pistol under his pillow until the night of his death. He was haunted by the faces of the men who had not come back, the particular weight of survivor's guilt in a man who had repeatedly been the only one left standing. He became, in his later years, an advocate for veterans struggling with the invisible wounds of combat, working to destigmatize mental illness among servicemen at a time when such advocacy required its own form of courage. On Veterans Day in the 1950s, a journalist asked Murphy what the most memorable day of the war had been for him. The journalist expected perhaps Holtzwihr, the burning tank destroyer, the 250 men, the hour that had defined his legend. Murphy thought for a moment. Then he answered, "I think it was. I've even forgotten the exact date, but I was on a train going for a little rest in the Riviera, and I heard the announcement that the war in Europe was over. And there's nothing that could top that for me, because then those 3 years had seemed much longer than they really were, and I saw a lot of good men come and go. Not the burning tank destroyer, not the Medal of Honor, a train. The sound of an announcement. The war being over. On May 28, 1971, Audie Leon Murphy boarded a twin-engine Aero Commander at DeKalb Peachtree Airport in Atlanta, Georgia, bound for Martinsville, Virginia. He was 45 years old. The aircraft struck a mountain ridge in bad weather and went down in the Blue Ridge, killing all 6 aboard. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery on June 7, 1971, at his own request, recorded well before his death, in the particular modesty of a man who had spent his adult life being uncomfortable with the attention his courage had earned. The gold lettering reserved exclusively for Medal of Honor recipients was omitted from his headstone. He preferred the plain inscription of an ordinary soldier, his name, his rank, his dates, nothing more. There is a memorial today at the edge of the Boys to Reed Weir, on the ground where the drainage ditch ran beside the road that led from the forest to Holtzwihr. It stands among trees that have grown back over the decades, filling in the spaces left by the artillery, rising over the frozen ground that is frozen no longer, covering over the landscape of that afternoon as landscape always covers over what has happened to it. not forgetting exactly, but absorbing the way a living thing absorbs what it has survived. French civilians tend the memorial. They know the name of the man it commemorates. They know what happened in this place, the field, across which 250 soldiers advanced on January 26, 1945, is quiet now. Snow falls on it in winter, as it fell on that afternoon, covering the grass in white, restoring the landscape to something resembling what it looked like when the Jag Panthers came through the mist. There is no burning tank destroyer at the road's edge. There is no field telephone. There is no 19-year-old boy from Texas standing on fire, calling in coordinates, holding the weight of everything a free nation can ask of a single human being. But there is the memory of it, and the memory of it matters, not as a monument to violence, not as a celebration of war's peculiar hierarchies of valor, but as a record of what human beings are capable of when they have decided, for reasons that go beyond tactics and ideology, and the calculations of any general's map, that some things are worth protecting at any cost. The men of Company B, the 18 survivors of a company that had gone into those woods with over 100, came out of the boys to Outnumbered because one man had made a decision to stay. They went home, eventually, to their towns and their families and their ordinary lives, carrying with them the particular knowledge of what they had witnessed, that there exists in the human character, at its most tested and most extreme, a capacity for courage so far beyond the ordinary scale of things that the only honest response to it is silence. Murphy himself offered no grand pronouncements about what he had done at Holtzwihr. He had done what needed to be done with the tools available to him in the time available. The .50 caliber ammunition had fed through the gun. The rounds had gone down range. The artillery had fallen where he directed it. The Germans had stopped coming. That was what happened. Everything else, the Medal of Honor, the magazine covers, the films, the medals that filled a uniform like constellations, was what other people made of it. Murphy himself understood the event the way he understood everything he had done in 3 years of continuous combat, as the price of keeping his men alive, as the fundamental transaction of a soldier's existence. And yet there is something larger that this story holds, something that exceeds the specific dimensions of one man's courage on one frozen afternoon. The .50 caliber rounds that Murphy fed through that gun, each one a product of the industrial democracy that had sent him across an ocean to stand on a burning vehicle in Alsace-Lorraine, were the expression of a civilization's commitment to its own survival, made tangible in metal and brass and the mechanics of a well-designed weapon. The democracy that had given a sharecropper's son from Kingston, Texas, the chance to become a soldier, to earn a battlefield commission through merit rather than birth, to stand on equal ground with generals who had attended the finest military academies, that democracy had asked him in the end to defend it with his body. And he had. Freedom is not an abstraction. It is a thing that has to be held in specific places by specific people at specific moments in history when the alternative presents itself in the form of armor and white-suited infantry advancing through the snow. It was held on January 26, 1945, in a frozen forest in Alsace-Lorraine, by a boy who had never owned anything, who had been given nothing by the world except the hardness to endure it, who stood on a burning machine and refused to let the line move back, and whose grave at Arlington, by his own choice, carries no gold lettering, no special distinction, no announcement of what he was, only his name, only his dates, the plain inscription of an ordinary soldier. That was, perhaps, the greatest truth of all, that the most extraordinary act of individual courage in the history of the American Army in the Second World War was performed by a man who, when it was over, simply wanted to be remembered as someone who had done his job. He had. And the world is different